It's a Friday edition of PFTPM. Joining us now, the man who is in charge of the NFL's response to an unprecedented challenge as the pandemic intersects with professional football. It's Chief Medical Officer Alan Sills joining us this morning. Dr. Sills, great to see you as always. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Hey, it's great to have you. And one of the things that I've been kicking around is I try to better understand how a pandemic works and how a pandemic meshes, if at all, with professional sports. And we've seen it play out with different sports over the past several months. From your perspective, I mean, you have spent your life, your professional life, focused on brain health, on brain surgery. How hard has it been for you to pivot to becoming essentially on the fly an expert in epidemiology?
Well, Mike, I'm certainly not becoming an expert in epidemiology, but I think this is something that's been hard for all of us in the medical world. None of us have experienced anything like this before in our medical careers. We've obviously seen various epidemics, but this one is very unique. So I think that's why it's become very much a team effort. We've had to, certainly for me personally, I've had to lean on the expertise and advice of many different people who are infectious disease experts, population health experts, epidemiologists, and certainly my colleagues in sports medicine around the world with other professional sports leagues. So we've had to collaborate, communicate with each other because all of us are in uncharted waters here. And the good news is that we can learn from each other. And I think that's been one of the very gratifying things about this pandemic is this hasn't been about what the NFL is doing or the NBA. This has been about us as a medical community trying to proactively address what is a very novel and emerging virus. And so we've had more communication collaboration than we probably ever had before across all of those leagues and all of those different levels of expertise.
Which league would you say you've learned the most from?
Boy, it'd be hard to say any one because every single person has been very instructive. I mean, I think, again, I talk regularly each week with Major League Baseball, with NBA, with National Hockey League, with Major League Soccer, but we've also talked with Australian Football League, with rugby. We've talked with the Bundesliga, the English Premier League. So I have to say, Mike, every single one of them has added something and has expanded our thinking. And again, we've shared in both directions what we're doing, listening to what they're doing. And I think that communication will continue.
How much has it added to the challenge for the NFL to successfully pull off the season, given that places like Germany, where the Bundesliga plays, England, where the Premier League plays, those places seem to have, as a society, done better getting the virus under control, getting to the other side of the pandemic? Not that it's gone, but they've handled it better than we have as a country. How much has that complicated the effort to play football in this climate?
Well, I think it's no doubt that the situation in our country is more challenging. As you mentioned, some of those other countries have done a much better job or have had, fewer cases, and the pandemic is at a different state. And so it does make our job more complex in America. But again, I think each country is unique, each population is unique, each sport is unique. As you know, there are different risk levels and there are different things we can do to mitigate risk among our different sports. But I think we all clearly realize we have a huge challenge on our hands. This is really hard. This isn't just hard for us as the NFL or pro sports. This is hard for us as a country. How are we going to try to navigate our way through this pandemic? And really, in a sense, Mike, can we learn to live with this virus? Because from what I read and hear and see, and I'm sure you do the same things, I don't expect that this is going to go away or disappear anytime soon. So it's not about waiting for that day when it disappears. We all hope that day is not far off. But until it does, what can we do to mitigate risk and try to establish some sense of normalcy around our lives, but do so in a thoughtful and safe way? I think that's the question that not just the NFL is trying to answer or other sports leagues, but that's what schools and businesses and places of worship, we all have that very same objective and that very same challenge.
I agree with you completely on that point, that we have to assume it's going to hang around, maybe for multiple NFL seasons. And you're in a far better position than I am to understand the issues, to grasp the nuances. But the one thing to me that seems to be the topic that would most affect the NFL, point of care testing. When point of care testing is available at a sufficiently high accuracy rate where you can essentially set up a barrier into the team facility, into the stadium, onto the bus, onto the plane, wherever you decide to have the testing that gives you a result then and there positive or negative, that you can trust. That seems to be the thing that will change everything for the NFL. Am I wrong in thinking that?
Well, I would agree and disagree with part of that. And let me explain. Absolutely. We would all love to have accurate, immediate, widely available point of care testing. Again, that's not just something in the NFL. That's across our medical enterprise. Is everyone would like to have a more accurate, more widely available test. So full stop, that will be a step forward for everyone. But I think we also have to recognize what the limitations of testing are. Testing is not prevention. Testing is about containment. So testing doesn't prevent you from getting the virus in the first place. What prevents you from getting the virus are things like wearing a mask, physical distancing, staying away from sick people, staying home if you're sick, staying away from crowded places. And all of those risk mitigation strategies are not going to change no matter what the status of testing is. So testing is important. It's certainly something that's part of a chain, but I think of all these different links in the chain, and there are many other links that I think are equally important with testing. So love to see point of care tests available, but it's not going to change that fundamental need to still do all those other things that keep people safe, because masks, distancing, staying home when you're sick, staying away from sick people, those things are about prevention. Testing is about containment.
But as it currently stands, when you got a 24-hour lag between sample collection and test result, if you have somebody who had been negative, you find out tomorrow that today is the day he's positive. Ideally, that is a donut hole that the NFL would love to close.
No question, would love to close that, but I'd go back again and say, if in that 24-hour period that you mentioned, that individual has stayed physically distant, has worn a mask, done all of those things, then again, there should be a margin of safety there for the individual and for the others. And that's why we have to recognize, Mike, in medicine, there's almost no test that's going to be 100% accurate all the time. So even as these tests get better and better, we still have to realize, hey, the test could be wrong. It could be a false negative. So that's why we still have to do all of those other measures and protect ourselves no matter what the test results are telling us.
And by all accounts, the measures that have been put in place at the various teams are excellent. I remember seeing the memo that was distributed to the teams June 7 with the first cut of what the protocols would be. And it is detailed, it is thorough, and it creates a sense that the team facilities will be safe. The traveling squad, when you go on the bus, the plane, to the hotels, it will be safe. At the stadium, everyone will be safe. But then at some point, football gets played. And that's the juxtaposition that I struggle with the most, that we can cross every T and dot every I and keep everyone apart and wear masks and be safe. But then it's 11 on 11 football with guys lined up right across from each other, breathing and sweating and spitting and bleeding. And how do we reconcile all the things we're doing to keep guys safe for the 153 hours a week they're not in a game, and then to keep them safe for the 3 hours when they're out there in that mix of other human beings who may be positive and we just don't know it yet?
Yeah, well, I think you framed it exactly right. If we can do everything right in those 153 hours leading up to the game, then that's going to make it safer during that 3 hour period, because we're hopefully going to arrive at the field with everyone who's not infected. And so you exactly described it. Doing it right all the time leading up to the game is what helps us get to the game site with hopefully no infections in anyone that's participating. And in the same way, that's why we'll do pregame testing again to try to add to that knowledge base. But we've said all along, Mike, you're right. Physical distance and football, they don't go together. You can't play football and be physically distant, or at least you can't play it very well in most positions. So I think you have to look at how do we arrive there in an uninfected state. And then certainly we will look at and learn from what happens on the field as well. I do think there's some things you can do during that 3 hour period, how you construct your benches, what people do when they're off the field, minimizing risks at other times in and around, who's in that environment, who's coming through the bench area. Those things are all going to matter. The other thing we have to recognize is we'll continue to learn from other sports leagues here. As I mentioned, we've talked with, for example, Australian football, with rugby. They're not exact parallels to NFL football, but there's a lot of face-to-face contact, and in those sports with unhelmeted players. So we'll take away some learnings from that. And to date, knock on wood, they've not seen on-field transmission, but I think it's something we have to continue to be vigilant about. We'll also get a lot of data. You've heard about those chips that we're using for proximity tracing, and we'll understand a lot more about the interactions on the field, who really is around who and for what period of time. So it is clearly a vulnerability and something we have to continue to address as aggressively as we can.
And there's an avalanche of information out there about this virus. It's impossible to keep up with it. But one thing that has landed on my radar screen, and I know that there's a belief in some league circles that this will be true, that on-field transmission, either in an open-air stadium or in a dome that has a state-of-the-art ventilation system, that is going to be far more difficult than transmission in a confined space, indoors. How confident are we as of right now that there will be a significant difference between transmission rates in a building versus transmission rates on a football field?
Well, Mike, I think, like you said, a lot of experts that I talk to feel like that'll be the case, but the reality is we're still learning about that. We don't have a season of football or any even games to sort of vet that hypothesis. That has been the experience of these other sports leagues around the world that I mentioned that have started up. And again, I think the population health and epidemiology experts I talk to, they do believe that these open air environments, as you said, either inside or outside, and the ventilation, that it will help. So again, I think there's a lot there that we can be somewhat reassured by, but there's going to be no substitute for us actually getting into it, gathering the data, looking at it very carefully, and then adjusting. I think, Mike, one of the things we've said throughout is we're going to have to be flexible and adaptable, because we're going to continue to learn things, not only from our own experience, but from these other leagues. And as we learn those things, we'll have to fine tune what we're doing. You mentioned all those protocols, and we spent hours and hours and hours putting those together with a wide variety of experts. But those protocols will change, they'll grow, and they'll develop, and they'll get better. That's kind of the nature of medicine, is we're always learning and improving. And I think that'll be the case here.
One other issue, as we look for potential risks that would either bring the virus to the facility or take the virus out of the facility if an outbreak happens, is the concept of players going home every night. And I know that a full league-wide bubble like the NBA and the NHL are doing is completely impractical. Too many teams, too many people, too much time, too much expense. It doesn't make sense. Has any thought been given to the possibility of hardening the bubble around the 32 teams? And I know this would be a major hardship for the players and their families and the coaches and their families, but basically sequestering the team from the rest of the world, staying in a facility, staying in a hotel. Matt Ryan, the Falcons quarterback, told us the other day they have townhouses at their facility where they have individual bathrooms and changing areas and beds. Has there been any thought been given to the possibility of having a hard bubble around the 32 teams and having the players and the coaches and everyone else who's essential to the operation be there all season long without ever leaving?
Well, we've certainly talked about and debated every idea, including that idea, and been tried to be very open-minded and thoughtful about that. And we've looked at a number of different scenarios. And I think we landed on something that we feel combines the margin of safety with the practicality that you mentioned. But I like to describe what we're doing is what we call a virtual football bubble, which means when guys are at the facility, we know that we've got the protocols, we've got everything in place. We've done a lot of work, and together with the Players Association, around education. What do you do when you leave the facility? And it's our hope that players, coaches, and staff, because again, this isn't just about players, it's about everybody, that they are going to primarily go home. It's not to say they're never going to leave their homes, but when they do go out, they're going to use the appropriate preventive measures and do all they can to keep themselves safe. So in a sense, it is that bubble concept, but it's just extended out to each individual player's environment. And again, as you point out, you have to rely on each person to make really important choices about what they do and trying to mitigate risk for themselves. But I would just point back, Mike, again, to being flexible and adaptable. As we get into the season and we see what the data shows us, we're going to remain open to all of these different scenarios and seeing what seems to be the most effective.
So you're saying there is a possibility at some point, if there are outbreaks, that there could be a sequestration of players and coaches and teams in a hotel or in a facility?
I think all options are on the table. We've said that we are going to continue to evaluate at every point and do what's safest for everyone involved. And so, best way I can answer that is to say all options remain on the table, and we'll have to deal with each situation as it comes up in what we think is the safest and most thoughtful way.
Last one for you, and I appreciate you giving us so much time today. As it relates to the current model, the virtual bubble, as you explained it, with players going home at the end of the day, how much of the success or failure of that model hinges on whether or not schools are open? Because the player can do all the right things, but if they have kids that are in school and they're at school and they get the virus and bring it home, player gets the virus and brings it to the facility, 24-hour lag between sample collection and test result, the virus has gotten into the building.
Yeah, it's a great question, Mike. And again, it's something that's still being studied. Again, not just for an NFL setting, but how frequently are kids vectors and how do they transmit? What do those rates look like? And even within households, this is something that's still somewhat of a mystery about this virus. You would think that if someone in the household is infected, that 100% of those close contacts in the household would get infected. And that doesn't seem to happen. And we don't really understand why. Why is it that in some situations, everyone in the house is completely safe and in other situations, they become infected? So it is a vulnerability. I think, again, we've done a tremendous amount of education, as has the Players Association, to players and their families. For example, I've been on several Zoom calls just this week with organizations where it was players and families gathered together, and we've talked with spouses and household cohabitants and children about these issues. And everyone is going to be in this together in the sense of trying to make these good choices and do what they can to mitigate risk. So again, it is very much more so than ever. It's not trite to say this is a team effort, and every single person in that team ecosystem is going to have responsibility to each other person.
That's one thing that's been very encouraging to me as the players return and the coaches send a message and the players send a message. The more guys buy into it and their families buy into it and understand that everyone needs to be buttoned up across the board for this to work. Hopefully that will happen. Hopefully we'll get our 256 regular season games, 13 postseason games with minimal outbreaks. Dr. Sills, we appreciate your time today. We wish you all the best as you embark on a challenge that no NFL chief medical officer has ever embarked on. We wish you the best with that. And we hope to talk to you down the road.
Hey, thanks very much. Appreciate it. Best wishes to you, and I'll look forward to catching up down the road.
All right, take care.
Hi, I'm Mike Tirico, and thanks for watching. Make sure to hit subscribe for the latest news and highlights from NBC Sports.